afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Good. And welcome to the College of Liberal Arts Fall Roundtable, Democracy Imperiled, Why Your Vote Matters. I am Dean Chris Chulos of the College of Liberal Arts, and it's encouraging to see so many people here. We have others joining us virtually. This roundtable is connected to two of my dean's initiatives in the college that I want to tell you about. And you can find more information online if you go to our website. The first is called Democracy Today. So one of the critical topics of the time we live in is the state of democracy. The presence, absence, or even level of democratic institutions in a country impacts what it means to educate individuals like yourselves who are knowledgeable, practical, critical thinkers, and engaged in their communities. Democracy Today provides opportunities for cross-disciplinary and cross-departmental, and I'll say cross-collegial collaboration, and asks three fundamental questions. What makes a 21st century democracy, what makes a 21st century society democratic? How can democracy be sustained in the United States? What role and responsibility do higher education and the liberal arts have in sustaining a democratic society? The second Dean's initiative is called Commemorative Moments. This initiative provides a framework for the College of Liberal Arts to consider and reconsider aspects of the past, what we term moments, that are important to the values of interdisciplinarity, curiosity, creativity, critical thinking, integrity and tolerance through inclusion and diversity, and improvement of the communities in which we live by being engaged, informed citizens. That's a lot, isn't it? The College of Liberal Arts is a natural place to ask big questions about the world we live in and to provide answers and solutions that underscore the relevance of higher education in the 21st century. Tonight, we welcome you into that conversation. I'd like to express a moment of gratitude to the Democracy Today and Commemorative Moment committees. These are groups of faculty and staff who are dedicated through their time and efforts and who regularly meet to provide guidance to these initiatives. And I want to make a special note. After this roundtable, there is a location right across from that cafe, the cafe, where you can register to vote if you still need to register to vote, or you can get information on how to vote if you're living away from home and would still like to vote but can't make it on election day. I now will introduce tonight's roundtable moderator, Dr. Allison McCartney, who is standing right here next to me, professor of political science, faculty director of the Honors College, as well as the founder of Towson University's Model UN. Allison.
Thank you, Dean Chulos. So I'd like to begin by welcoming our panelists today. I'd like to thank them all for taking time out of their busy schedules to prepare their comments and to be here today to talk about a very important and very difficult topic. Let's see, I'm going to go in the order that they're seated in from the end over there. Dr. Todd Kenwright is a professor of secondary and middle school education. In addition to many articles, he published an edited book, Geography and Social Justice in the Classroom. As a teacher educator, he helps to build the next generation of social studies teachers for Maryland and the world. Seated next to him is Dr. Michael Allen. He's an assistant professor of geography and brand new faculty member at Towson University. He earned his PhD from Kent State University, and he explores the intersection of weather, climate change, public health, and environmental hazards. Dr. Allen's seasonal climate change research has been featured in National Geographic, and he's worked alongside key stakeholders to improve climate literacy and resilience to climate stressors. Next, right there in the middle, we have Dr. Don Wards, who's a professor of political science and director of African and African American studies here at Towson University. He teaches courses in American politics, urban politics, and African American politics, as well as African and African American studies. His recent research focuses on morality and African American politics and community development. Next, we have Dr. Deborah Baer, who teaches for the undergraduate program in religious studies and the graduate program in Jewish studies at Towson University. Her research explores how classical rabbinic texts approach legal and ethical problems and examines how those approaches might be adopted and adapted by contemporary thinkers. And then finally, last but definitely not least, Dr. Andrew Deemer is an associate professor in the history department, where he has taught African American history here since 2011. He is the author of 2 books, The Politics of Black Citizenship, Free African Americans in the Mid-Atlantic Borderland, 1817 to 1863. That was published in 2016. And published next month, just about to be hot off the presses, his next book, Vigilance, The Life of William Still, Father of the Underground Railroad. Each panelist will have 5 minutes for comments regarding the questions of this roundtable, and then we'll proceed to a question and answer session. Now, to our panelists, let me begin with 3 simple questions, and do not let the fact that I am wearing black, all black, and a blue Ukraine scarf sway you to change your comments in any way. That's just my own personal statement about democracy imperiled. But 3 simple questions, which I know you're all addressing in different ways and to different degrees. First, what does it mean to say that a democracy is imperiled? Second, is American democracy imperiled? And finally, why or why not? So with that being said, we're going to start with Dr. Kenwright, who has a, oh, what happened to my, here we go. He has a PowerPoint, so I'm going to go ahead and share the screen there. So, oh wait, no, that's not the right. Got it? Okay.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor McCartney. It's a delight to be here with you today, and I do want to thank once again Dean Chulos for convening today's panel discussion. I'm holding here a book. This is Mouse, that was recently banned in a school district in Tennessee earlier this year. Here's another book, maybe a little more familiar for some of you, The Mockingbird, that was banned in a school district in the state of Washington earlier this year. As we know, more and more parents are challenging books. The Moms of Liberty, for example, is a growing network of parents who seek to shape what students read and learn in schools. They're taking aim at certain books as offensive. Now, we would all agree that books are powerful, but who decides if a book is fit for reading? In a democracy like ours, who has the authority to make this decision? The government, publishers, librarians, local school boards, teachers, parents, or individual readers. Censorship and banning of books are not at all new. Think the Puritans. From time to time, certain teaching of topics and even languages have been restricted. I'm thinking of the Scopes trial in 1925 about the teaching of evolution in science class, and the bans against the teaching about communism in the 1950s. Also, remember the bans against German language instruction, not only during World War I, but afterwards. Over the last several years, the number of challenges to books has risen dramatically. According to the Library Association, American Library Association, 1,597 books were affected by censorship attempts in 2021 alone. So which books were challenged, why, and by whom? Let's take a quick look. I'll walk you through here for a moment some of the stats that are maintained by the ALA. So who challenges the books? In general, it's parents. You'll note here, I think students initiate challenges less than 1% of the time. No surprise. So where do these challenges take place? Chiefly, it is school libraries that are the target of those challenges. And then in terms of what's being challenged, typically it is a book, although from time to time a film or other media might be in the crosshairs. So those reasons for challenges, you can see those toward the bottom of the box, and certainly some of the hot button issues that are in our political discourse show up there. I want to dig a little bit deeper for a moment. So subject matter of banned content. We'll take a look here that these graphs do not add up to 100 because several books have more than one theme that some may find objectionable. So in particular there, you'll see for 41%, that's LGBTQIA plus themes. Very close next to that. 40% is a protagonist or prominent secondary characters of color. A little bit further from there, you can see some of the other topics and certainly sexual content at 22% looms large as well. So book bans by state. We consider states for just a moment. It may not be a surprise for some of you that have your barometer on politics to see that Florida and Texas certainly have some of the highest numbers of book bans in the country. We could attribute some of that certainly to the size and the population of those states. So too, we could ask a question, why not California or New York, which are also very large states in terms of population? I think if we understand politics a bit, we can answer that question. If you're wondering or asking yourself, well, what are some of the most challenged books here in the United States in the last year? I'll give you that list, and as you take a look at that list, I'll talk further here. And so one of the pieces to keep in mind is that we see a range of reasons listed, and then in particular, book bans have taken place across the United States. The great irony, of course, is that the more a book is challenged, the more copies it sells. And that's much to the delight of the author and publisher. Now, I would argue that the free and open exchange of ideas is necessary, but not sufficient for our vibrant democracy. Again, the free and open exchange of ideas is necessary, but not sufficient for a vibrant democracy. In Maryland at the moment, much of the political discussion focuses on the gubernatorial race here and the balance of power that lies in the Senate and the House. Yet down ballot races for school board members are more important than you may think. The Moms of Liberty have placed a priority on challenging books and influencing school board elections. With more than 240 local chapters, they are asking candidates to sign a parent pledge as a show of loyalty. Now, there are more than 13,000 school districts in the United States, and here in Maryland, there are 24 such public school districts, but only a handful of those all but a handful of those have members that are elected. With the upcoming election, I certainly urge you to do your homework. Make sure that you're registered, and by all means, make a plan of where and when to vote. I'll close with an observation by American philosopher John Dewey in 1939. In the end, he writes, the final guarantee of democracy is in free gatherings of neighbors on the street corner to discuss back and forth what is read. With that, I turn to my colleague, Mike Allen, for his overview.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kenwright.
It's funny, they were told to give 5 minutes. It's hard to make a 5-minute presentation than it would be to make a 2-hour presentation. All the students probably appreciate that. As is mentioned, I'm the newest up on this panel, so thanks for coming out this evening. And I have a series of images on this first slide that represents some of the topics that I'll be talking about, right? Climate change, prolonged drought, extreme heat, forced migration, food insecurity, public health, the list goes on and on. And so we can think about recent events with Hurricane Ian, a catastrophic hurricane in terms of the impact it has, the costs that it will forbear, but also how does that intersect with issues like wildfires in public health. The face of climate change, for better or for worse. As a climatologist, we are taught to talk about random statistics, such as the Earth has warmed 1.3 degrees Celsius in the last 150 years. Sea level has risen in places like Market, Virginia by 15 inches over the last 80 years. There are far-reaching implications. But most of us in this room that are not climate scientists, this is the face of climate change, right? The polar bear, the cute, cuddly polar bear that Coca-Cola made famous decades ago. And I often ask students if you've ever cuddled with a polar bear, and I've yet to find somebody that has, because a polar bear will kill you And yet we have this narrative regarding the issue of climate change as the face of this polar bear. And so if you think about democracy and the implications that climate will have on democracies and state governments and national economies, right? We can think about the implications. Dr. Geographic talked about interactions, interconnections, and implications. The decisions that we make today have far-reaching implications. Similarly, the decisions that we don't make today have far-reaching implications. Dr. Scott Denny at Colorado State University, who just received the American Geophysical Union Climate Communication Award, talks about the issue of climate change using 3 words. It's simple. Now, again, for the layperson, it may not seem so simple, but stay with me, right? The Earth is warming. And why is it warming? Well, it's warming because of greenhouse gases. Yeah, greenhouse gases naturally exist, but we've enhanced those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere through a variety of decisions that we've made in terms of transportation, in terms of food resources, et cetera. So it's rather simple. Science is. The second S, not only is climate change simple, but it's also potentially serious. We can think about Hurricane Ian recently. Hurricane Ian was not caused by climate change, to clarify, but a warming of the planet, a warming of the oceans has led to a higher probability of such extreme events. The European heat wave, the UK heat wave that happened several weeks ago, in which the UK set their all-time record ever. This part of the world does not have air conditioning, so in terms of capacity, there is a challenge. I get uncomfortable with the temperature that's 70 degrees, let alone if it's 110 degrees without air conditioning, right? They're not going too far to see local impacts. Ellicott City, I'm not pronouncing that correctly. It's clarified by my students this morning. Major flooding, 1,000-year flood events. Multiple of those 1,000-year flood events in the last several years. And so the probability of heavy rain has increased with all the warming of our atmosphere. And again, the world is connected. So wildfires there in California, Pacific Northwest, impact us here in terms of the photos that we take at sunset or the air that we breathe at sunrise, right? That emanation that you see on the right hand side. So I was tasked with talking about the issue of climate change, but also the aspect of pollution. I just was reading before I rolled in this afternoon about the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and the Clean Water Act policy being punted down the road. And so these issues that we're seeing and talking about in terms of environmental equity, environmental safeguard to drinking water, but in Michigan, again, we don't have to go very far. We often contextualize these issues as they're being far away or they're being not me, but we have evidence of these impacts locally in our communities. We can think about the aspect of redlining. If you know what redlining is, I can talk to you after this or take a question on the topic. But redlining was a federal policy in the 1930s that segregated many US cities. 80, 100 years later, you still see evidence of environmental justice associated with this, in this case, heat waves. Higher probability heat waves due to lack of impervious, lack of tree canopy, and increased impervious surface, for example. Finally, Scott Denny talks about climate change is simple, serious, but this is the big but that we often don't communicate as climate scientists. It's solvable. We don't need innovation. The sun has been heating the planet for a long time. So how do we capture that energy and utilize it? Iceland has been using geothermal energy for more than 100 years. We don't need innovation. We need the political and economic capacity to address these challenges. I yield the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Allen. Our remaining panelists do not have slides. This was totally optional. So now I shall turn everything over to Dr. Don Works.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't want to think I was slacking. So, thinking about voting rights, I'm reflecting on how I would normally teach American government. I haven't taught it in person in a long time, but on the first day of class, I would always ask students to divide into groups, and then in each group, I'd say, write down your list or your criteria for what makes a country a democracy. I said, don't try to be, don't get cute and say, well, it must have 50 states. No, just what would make a country a democracy? Write down your criteria. And then I would say, based on your criteria, discuss whether or not the United States is a democracy. And if you say yes, tell me when it became one. If you say no, then say why. Why not? And I'm thinking, and the purpose of that exercise is to get students thinking about democracy, as something that evolves over time. I would sometimes challenge them on the criteria that they said. If you say that, for example, voting rights, people must have voting rights. Well, who? All adults or most adults, etc. And if you're going to say that to be a democracy, then most adults, all adults should have, the right to vote. When would you say America became a democracy? Is America a democracy? And so on the first day of class, students are thinking, well, by that criteria, maybe yes, maybe no. And if it's yes, the 1920s, maybe when women got the right to vote, well, then it's maybe 1960s when other folks got the right. Well, and so usually when I talk about it in class, I'm this democracy evolving and the U.S. becoming more and more democratic. But when we talk about voting rights, it's not necessarily, strictly a story of progress. There's an up and a down. There's a progress and a regress. And so as we think about voting rights today, if you look back, we can see moments of progress and then moments where the nation took huge steps back. Right? So using the African American experience, right? You can think about post-emancipation after the Civil War. The passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments. I always ask my students, so the 15th Amendment, gives Black men the right to vote. Then I always ask, were they able to successfully use that right to vote in those years during Reconstruction? And I said, raise your hand if you think they were able to successfully use that right to vote. I'll ask you guys. Raise your hand if you think Black men were able to use the right to vote successfully during Reconstruction. Raise your hand. All right? You're all wrong, except Paul. Paul's right. They did. They were very successful. Right? They elected over 1,500 Black men were elected to office in the former Confederate States. Between 1860 and Andrew Rose is correct. Between 1860 and 1900, 20 people served in 20 Black men served in the U.S. Congress. Right? So it's a story of progress. But then what happened? And then, post-Reconstruction, you get the end of Reconstruction, you get this campaign of terror and violence that chases Black people, Black men out of politics. And then you get the passage of laws that make it virtually impossible for folks to vote. And so there's progress and there's regress. And I was thinking about that before today, and then I said, well, it wasn't just Black folks who were impacted by those policies. Right? I would look, Asian Americans were impacted. Well, when they could eventually naturalize and become citizens, they were impacted by those policies, poll taxes, literacy tests. Latinos were impacted by those policies that were put in place to prevent Black men from being able to vote, especially Black men in vote. And then, so when you look back, you see this progress and regress, and then you see the passage of the Voting Rights Act, then you start to see some more progress, right? Protection of the right to vote. And now I think we're in the stage where, many would argue we're taking steps back. And what history shows us is that those steps back in terms of people putting impediments in the way of folks being able to vote, it's about the practical outcome of their use of that vote, right? So when we look at the 19th century, there's a success of certain populations, and so folks want to win, so they put impediments of being able to vote. And if we look at what's going on right now around the country, we see a lot of efforts to put impediments or obstacles in the way of people being able to vote. Some argue, well, this is because it's to prevent voter fraud. Well, nobody with a straight face can say that there's been a lot of evidence of voter fraud, right? This is really about trying to win elections. And when we look at the things folks are doing, right, making it harder to I'll run down a list of things that have been done recently, shortening the window from which to deliver mail ballots, limiting the use of absentee ballots, eliminating or limiting the use of drop-off sites for mail-in ballots. Voter ID laws we can talk about some more. The purging of the voter roll. So if someone hasn't voted or there's any kind of supposed discrepancy, they get purged from the roll. And what we know is that the vast majority of folks who are being purged, that it was done inappropriately. And so the discussion about voting rights in the current context should be one of, okay, why are folks doing it? They want to win. Why did they do it in the past? Because they want to win. And so I kind of, what I've been thinking about lately is, well, has the U.S. ever really been committed to democracy? Have we been committed to democracy? Have we been committed to voting rights? And that's kind of the question I'll pose for the audience. I can argue, no, folks have been committed to winning. If me having the right to vote helps me win, then I've got my own right to vote. But if you not having the right to vote helps me win, then your right to vote. I might even try to constrain it. So to the question of democracy in peril, I don't know, has it ever been fully realized? Would be my answer to that question. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Wertz. Dr. Baer?
All right, well, I am a scholar of religion and religious Christian. I focus on Judaism and Jewish law and how it engages in ethical questions. And I think that training is part of why I came to this question. I've asked you about women's reproductive rights, and I'm going to talk a bit about abortion in particular. But I come to this discussion inherently with a focus on discourse. When I hear the question of whether democracy is in peril, I think about the nature of our discourse in our democracy and what that sounds like. We talk about issues of increasing polarization in history. And I actually think when it comes to the issues surrounding abortion, especially in the wake of the recent Supreme Court decision, and we're living in this sort of what I call post-Roe world, negotiating what that world looks like. I'm going to sound perhaps an unusually potentially hopeful note here, but I think our conversation is shifting or has the potential to shift in ways that are exciting. Because for a long time, our discourse about abortion has been two-sided, right? It's been a binary. You're pro-life or you're pro-choice. It's been very easy to demonize people on the other side. We hear those kinds of demonizing language thrown around, right? You're pro-life, people who are pro-choice are murderers. People on abortion are murderers. If you're pro-choice, people who are trying to restrict abortion access are misogynists, right? There's different kinds of language, but it's all like, I have a moral high ground, that person is evil. And now that abortion access is being forcibly worked out on the state level, whether you think that's a good thing or not, we're going to start seeing a lot of, and we are seeing a lot of different positions being charted. Citizens and legislators alike are having to think through the nitty-gritty details of different reasons why people seek abortions, the different circumstances they're in, the consequences of them having access to one or not having access to one. And it's leading people to make new assessments about why an abortion might be impermissible, why it should be illegal, and also why it might be warranted or even necessary. And I think this plurality of different decisions that are happening across the country or starting to happen across the country are charting kind of a new map for us, one that needs to be navigated differently from the rhetoric and slogans that we've seen associated with pro-life and pro-choice. We're learning there's lots of different ways and lots of different reasons to be pro-life or pro-choice. And there are cases where someone who identifies as pro-life might want to protect access to abortion. There are cases where someone who identifies as pro-choice might want to restrict access to abortion. And because of this shift, I think the discourse about abortion in Jewish law and Jewish tradition has actually started to mirror our public discourse more closely in ways that might be interesting and illustrative for those of us who are not necessarily Jewish, but who might help us think about our secular discourse in new ways. Not necessarily in the specific concept of the positions articulated, but in the ways that the issues have been talked about and thought through. So Jewish teachings on abortion do not map neatly onto either pro-life or pro-choice stances. Various classical sources from both the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic literature make it clear that Jewish law does not see the fetus as a full person while it is still within the mother's womb. So that's different from what we often hear articulated as pro-life. And that therefore the life of the mother takes precedence over that of the fetus. So if the fetus puts the life of the mother at risk in some way, an abortion is not only allowed, but it might even be mandated even towards the very end of pregnancy. The question, of course, that then Jewish legal thinkers have had to work through is what constitutes a risk to the mother. These are going to sound similar to questions that secular legal thinkers are now in American discourse. What if, for example, there is an 80% chance that the mother will develop a life-threatening condition if she continues with her pregnancy? What if there is a 10% chance? What if it will cause her to develop a debilitating health condition, but one that is not immediately life-threatening? What if it will damage her mental health in a way that could become life-threatening at some point? These are real questions that real women and real rabbis have faced in trying to negotiate how classical Jewish teachings on the issue should be applied to very specific cases in all of their complexity. And as you might imagine, people have not always agreed. I'm reminded of a case, the woman I actually know, she published her case when civil discourse was going on. She lives in Israel. She wrote about it. She was pregnant with twins, a very wanted pregnancy. Her water broke at 22 weeks, and there was a chance her doctor said that she would develop a life-threatening infection as a result. They counseled her to get an abortion, but they said it was up to her. She was very conflicted about what to do. She felt reasonably confident that she had access to very good medical care, that the risk to her life was small. She talked to a lot of different people, all of whom told her to do different things, right? She got lots of different counsel. And she was an Orthodox Jewish woman, so she and her husband decided to ask their rabbi, which is something people in that tradition often do. They consult Jewish law. And her husband consulted their rabbi, who responded. And this is a quote from him. "If there is even a chance that your wife will die, why are you asking this question?" So she had an abortion. Now, I think we can understand the reasoning of her rabbi in this case. His response makes sense, but it's not the only response that makes sense. Her friends who counseled her to continue with the pregnancy and hope for a good outcome, their response also makes sense. Her conflict over what to do makes sense. The future is not knowable. We can't know how things will play out, and different people will evaluate risks in different ways. The thing that I think is interesting about her case and many other cases like it in Jewish sources is people are starting from the same classical sources, articulating the same values and principles, reasoning through them, trying to figure out how to apply them to concrete, messy cases, and they're coming to different conclusions. And different conclusions, we can understand why they come to different conclusions, whichever conclusion you agree with. My point is that when our discourse shifts away from broad principles and positions and onto these kinds of concrete cases and all of their messiness, it becomes harder to see one answer as always right, one side as always having the high ground, the other side as wicked. Reading through these rabbinic discussions and rulings on abortion, we're going to see people read the exact same sources, start from the same values and principles, and then disagree about what those sources, principles, and values mean we should do in the world in this specific scenario. And I think actually that is the direction that discourse about abortion may be moving in the United States. And I think that actually is a hopeful direction for it to be moving. As we started seeing more positions started, more messiness in our discourse, I think we're going to hopefully move away from polarization so that we can have a richer conversation. And I think that this focus on cases, for me, I want to share the Jewish discussion about abortion here, not because of the particular content of their position, because of the way, the range of possibilities that it illustrates, the way of talking, where reasonable people with good intentions and limited knowledge disagree. I think that can be a helpful model for secular political discourse as well.
Thank you, Professor Baer. Okay, Professor Deemer, you're up.
Thank you. So I was asked to speak about efforts to ban the 1619 project, and by extension, whether or not that constitutes a threat to our democracy. So before I can do this, I have to explain to you what the 1619 project is. So many of you will know what it is, many of you won't. So it has its origins in an August 2019 issue of New York Times Magazine, in which scholars from various fields, artists, activists, journalists, attempted in various ways to wrestle with the legacies of slavery for American history. Many of these writers attempted to connect those legacies with particular present-day issues, mass incarceration, health care inequities, housing discrimination, etc. In the years since the publishing of this 1619 project, it's become something of a lightning rod for criticism. Primarily, though not exclusively, from the political right. So we can talk maybe later about other kinds of criticisms. But I think the right is where the fiercest criticisms of this project have come. President Trump, for example, proposed a 1776 commission which would produce an explicitly patriotic alternative to the 1619 project. There have been various efforts in Congress to ban the teaching of the 1619 project, but this hasn't really gone very far at a federal level. It's really been at the state level where these efforts have gained the most traction. In the last year, 17 states have imposed restrictions on how race and discrimination can be taught in public school classrooms, many of these explicitly mentioning the 1619 project. Texas, Florida, for example, have explicit restrictions on the use of this in school curriculums. Now, if we look at what actually is there in the 1619 project, what was written, from a certain perspective, and looking at it from the perspective of scholars who study this material, much of it is uncontroversial. Many of the claims that are being made are things that scholars have been writing and talking about for years. So what's the big deal? What is so controversial about the 1619 project? Well, I would argue that some of it is just bad faith arguing and misrepresentation. Much of the criticism is focused on the introductory essay itself by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who also was the sort of convener and organizer of this project, focusing often on very specific claims that she made about the American Revolution, for example. But more broadly, this criticism, again, that I think is often in bad faith, challenges the project's framing of US history. It argues, for example, that the project overemphasizes the persistence of white racism, that it minimizes the progress that has been made and the white contributions to that progress. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, that the whole project is in essence anti-American, that it is unpatriotic. Now, I would argue that if we actually read what is there, that this is not only a misrepresentation, but it is the opposite of what this project is attempting to accomplish. If you look at Nicole Hannah-Jones' introductory essay, for example, it begins with this anecdote about her veteran father raising the flag in the front yard of their home. I mean, it is a rumination on how African Americans can be patriotic in the face of all of this history. So the idea that it is somehow anti-American, I think, doesn't fly. She closes with this idea, and I'll quote from her: "Black people have seen the worst of America, yet somehow we still believe in its best." That is hardly an anti-American statement. So is this all just a big misunderstanding? Is this all just a problem of not reading carefully enough? Not so fast. I think there are real issues underlying this. I think this is where the threat to democracy comes, and this, in fact, suggests why these oppositions to the 1619 project have been so heated and why efforts to ban it have been so fierce. Ultimately, it matters how we teach and understand the past. Our understanding of the past informs how we understand the present and in fact, how we imagine what the future can be like. In other words, if you believe that American history, in American history, racism is slight, that it is relatively unimportant, that it has been dealt with and it has not been a problem for a very long time, then you believe that nothing needs to be done. If, on the other hand, you believe, as most of the authors of the 1619 project, that slavery was a fundamental, central aspect of American history, that discrimination continues and indeed continues to the present day, then you of course believe that something needs to be done. And so when we think about whether or not the attempts to ban teaching history a certain way are a threat to democracy, I would argue that it fundamentally is. Thank you.
Okay, I think that those presentations gave us a lot to think about in terms of the question about democracy, how it's doing, whether or not it is imperiled or not. At this time, we will go ahead and turn things over to you, to our audience. for questions. So, who wants to start? Nothing controversial or difficult here at all. Yes, ma'am.
Politicians often talk about how things like Social Security are kind of sacrosanct because old people vote in large numbers. I wonder if some of you from the different vantage points you took could talk about what you would see as different in your area if college age students, college age people, whether they're students or not, voted as regularly and in as large numbers as the other. And of course, that's I mean, it's not really within any of your areas, but student loan debt issues being bigger, but.
So can I talk about this? I may take a tangent on what you're saying. I think that, whether or not this is a question of college student voting, I think from my perspective, the topic that I was talking about, part of the controversy comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what we do in a history classroom, whether it's at a college level or a high school level. Much of, I think, the intensity of the fear about teaching history in whatever ways is this idea that history professors and teachers have some power over their students that I think we know that we don't have. I think that's students here. I can't tell my students how to vote. I wouldn't want to tell them how to vote.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to go there, but which isn't to say that there isn't a connection between what we teach in the classroom and how they see the world and how they want to vote as a result. I wonder if maybe giving people more insight into what that connection is and what that connection is not might also be a part of this. Maybe a soft way out of this, right? A way to allay people's fears and to make them more comfortable with teaching things that with which they are uncomfortable.
Okay, we have a question online.
So this is probably for Todd. How do districts decide what books should be banned or should not be banned?
Ooh, that's a tough one. In large part, as you might imagine, most school systems have a protocol, and in large part, you begin usually with a query that goes before the school leaders. So chiefly would go to the school principal, and the school principal might be alerted that there is a concern around a book that's on the shelves of the media center or the school library, or instead there may be a concern about a specific book that is assigned within the curriculum. I'll note here for a moment, To Kill a Mockingbird in the state of Washington in one district was removed as a required reading, and then instead there was a pivot to make it instead an optional reading, but clearly it was a response to a concern from a parent. So that large question, keep in mind there are 13,000 public school systems in the United States. To be frank, I think some school districts fly a bit under the radar in terms of some of their decision making. And I think as a result, I don't want to say that some of these decisions are being made in back room, sort of among people that are not having to answer to kind of the wider public. But I think we certainly do know that teachers and school librarians are the guardians of our democracy. And for quite some time, they have been willing to try to hold the party line in terms of being able to push for schools to have access to as many books as possible for students. And one concern is that now with social media and the temptation for some parents to put in a spotlight a decision or a particular page of a book that might be found offensive, that adds extra heat for those that might be either working in schools or in particular serving on school boards.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Yes, sir.
Hi, there has been a recurring theme, I guess, in everybody's, at least a little bit, a lot of mentions of things being more important on the state or even below that. And it's something I constantly think about. Two, as well, as I feel as if attention has purely been focused on these sort of big, exciting presidential elections, maybe a senator every now and then. But I think for most of American people, our attention our knowledge is purely focused on this stuff. So how do you all think we can change that? How can we encourage people to think more on the state and local levels? Because that's really where, these important decisions are actually being made.
I think that that's a really good point, and it's complicated because on one level, the national polarization is not necessarily reflected in local politics, because local politics, you end up focusing on more practical, immediate issues. It's usually not as much the symbolic type things, but I mean, now with the school board politics, that's a little different, but usually at the local level, folks are trying to solve practical problems, right? And so, it's like, are we we're gonna build this road or we're not? Gonna clean the streets or not? And so in those contexts, a lot of analysts say that's kind of good for democracy because, we can see each other in very practical terms. But the national level polarization has infused, state politics and then local politics, and so that makes it a little more complicated. I think that most people, the way we think about politics in the US, we don't really wrestle with the importance of what happens at the state level, and as a result, it's only the most energized folks who are involved in it, and then you get a politics that doesn't reflect what most people might really want. And so it is complicated and it's difficult. So I don't really have an answer to it, but I just think that is a complicated moment. And to Beth's earlier question about young people participating, I think that if young people vote and if young people engage, that forces a discourse that may not happen otherwise, right? And so even it's voting, but it's engaging and then presenting the issues that are important, and then voting, right? So it's not that changes. I mean, politicians and elected officials, they respond to what's being brought to them, and if folks are not engaged, then those issues are just completely ignored or viewed as irrelevant. And so all those things kind of go together. So at the state level, at the local level, young people mobilize and they have something that they care about, then the local officials have to deal with it. The state officials have to deal with it. And maybe the answer to your question is, if folks can just be energized to see how those levels of government respond to their concerns, then that might get them involved, and that might get other people involved who share their concerns.
Keep in mind, those of you who are part of the younger crowd here, that any decisions that are made, whether it's state, local, or national, you were the ones living with it the longest. And so in many ways, you have the most at stake for what's going on. I'd also like to say something to our online participants. Please feel free to pop questions into the Q&A. An online question here.
Are you concerned that democracy is taught less and less in secondary education in terms of citizenship, patriotism, and what is to be a democracy?
Go ahead, Todd.
Professor Deemer, you may want to weigh in on this as well. I'll speak for a moment to say, having been a former high school history and government teacher, at the secondary level, there's no question that there are existing standards, voluntary national standards that, in our case, the state of Maryland has adopted for what is required to be taught when it comes to civics and government. And in my opinion, that hasn't actually dramatically changed much at all. Much of the buzz and the argument around social studies actually has been maybe more in the history classes. However, a person by the name of Diana Hess, she's at the University of Wisconsin. She's done some work looking at the question of how we teach civics. And among other things, she's recognizing that in a hyper-polarized environment like we find ourselves, a partisan environment as well, that teachers obviously have to be doing the hard work of saying, when we're teaching about not only the structure and the function of government, inevitably issues will arise, and being able to be fair-minded and even-handed in the treatment of those issues. Because I think, much like Professor Deemer said just a few moments ago, we are loath to think for you. I mean, in some sense, as a teacher, that's the ultimate sort of sleight of hand for us to somehow say that we're indoctrinating or trying to think for you. Instead, the greatest compliment that I think most teachers and professors would say is did we equip you with the skills, the abilities, and the dispositions to think for yourself as a democracy demands?
If I could just add one thing to that, yes, I'm afraid about this. I think my suspicion is that the efforts to control what, and I'm talking here particularly about high school level teachers, can teach about citizenship, about American history, is less likely to produce the interpretation that the proponents of these restrictions want. In other words, I don't believe that they're going to get teachers teaching their version of these things to the citizenship, American history. What I fear it will produce is apathy. I fear that the teachers who would otherwise have taught citizenship and history in a certain way are prevented from doing so, or afraid to do so. And the result is just more and more apathy. I think that is one of the things that we see. It's not just polarization, but among some people, it's just the sense that nothing can be done, that there's nothing positive that can come out of anything. And that apathy, I think, is going to be a likely effect of all of this.
I want to follow up on that with like this idea of patriotism. So the first thing that pops into my mind is, what do we mean by patriotism? What does it mean to love America? What does it mean to be a patriot? And I think one of the disappointing aspects of current discourse for me is that what it means to be a patriot is kind of we're not talking about some essential values, right? Do you value democracy, right? Or do you value certain images or symbols? One of the interesting things about African American history, and Andrew can speak to this given his expertise in the books he's written, is that African Americans are often, have had the hardest time in terms of experiencing American democracy, but they've been some of the strongest advocates and defenders of it, right? I mean, I had this wonderful quote from Frederick Douglass saying, "I stand with the Bible and the Constitution." This is somebody who had been enslaved, who's fighting to end slavery. He's giving this speech on July 4th, or then July 5th, with reference to July 4th. And he's saying, look, I stand with the Constitution, right? Really? I mean, your people did this constitutional government enslaving your people. It says that you're not even a person and you can be owned and beaten and killed and whatever. And yet these folks are defending, like, who is more democratic, who's more patriotic than Frederick Douglass, right? Who also is very, very critical of America. And so what it means to be a patriot doesn't mean that you're not critical. And sometimes folks, unfortunately, some folks see that I can criticize America, but you can't. Right? If you criticize America, you're a patriotic. If I criticize America, I'm saying truth to the essence. And those are the things we need to kind of wrestle with in college. I don't know if you can really get to that in high school. It may be a little too complicated. But in terms of how this can be manifested in high school, I think when students are presented with some basic facts about America, you know, it's kind of hard to unring those bells. Right? When you learn about slavery, when you learn about, you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act, when you learn about, you know, segregation, you can't unring those bells once you've heard them. And how do you make sense of it? How do you love America when, you know, the governor of my state, you know, 50 years ago said segregation now, segregation now? How can I love that America? And that's what the schools have to be able to process. And unfortunately, too many folks don't trust that we can you can get there. You can learn that and still love America, right? I mean, African Americans have been doing it for hundreds of years, and I think most Americans can do it and would do it. So you don't have to necessarily indoctrinate with this, you know, sort of simplistic business. And you can maybe the idea of democracy can be attractive. If you see, wow, even in this context, people are drawn to these ideas, even when they're being oppressed by folks who reject those ideas, or who are only fake, act like they like those ideas, they can still be drawn to them despite that. So I think that's a more powerful argument for patriotism than anything.
To answer the question as well, just want to quickly throw in, when we talk about teaching in high school, we need to think about not only what we're teaching, but when we're teaching it, right? Because sometimes what happens in some school districts is they're teaching civics, the basics of citizenship, to ninth graders, And they've forgotten that by the time they're graduating and are about to enact those skills, actually use those skills. So just a side point. Thank you to the person online for their question. We had a question over here in person.
Feel as your adults too, and also the political climate we're in with a lot of us. I was born in 2000, so I'm only 22, but I grew up sending uncles and aunts there at the wars and sending them overseas. The recession definitely affected a lot of us. We've seen democracy repeatedly cannot help our families. At home, we've seen our families tearing down policies, and now as women, like this summer, we lost a lot of our own rights. So, and like with education, I'm an education major, there's a lot that goes into racism just in classrooms and early childhood classrooms. There's a lot we can do as voting. There's a lot we need to do as individuals, because big companies do still run a large portion of our government. And that's a lot that I think social media we're
Wants to comment on that? Mike? Media perceptions?
Up in St. Clair, the jungle, says you can't convince somebody of a fact the paycheck depends on it. I think that's not only discourse of climate, but there's maybe not economic value, but power is maybe that value in some way. Millennial and Gen Z is the largest voting cohort, just like what you read online, right? Their population is larger than the people that vote. So if you just vote, we just vote. I think the other issue, and this goes back to the education discussion a minute ago, is how we teach. So we teach civics, we teach economics, we teach poli-sci. There's no integration or limited integration across those things. Right? I talk about heat waves, mortality, and then I'm talking about redlining. How do you integrate the social sciences with the natural environmental sciences? We don't do that very well. Now it's changing. Interdisciplinary is a buzzword of the century, perhaps, but that takes work, and that's a lot of time, perhaps, to make those connections. And maybe not at the 9th grade level to make that connection. But if you learn about redlining, or Tom Hanks talked about learning about the Tulsa Massacre at the age of 50, how did he not learn about the Tulsa Massacre until he was 50? He's a historian, history major. He was raising the question on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, whatever you use, I suppose, about why he didn't learn about the Tulsa Massacre. How do we talk about that aspect within the context of environmental change, et cetera, et cetera?
Dr. Baer, would you like to say anything about social media and portrayal of women's issues?
Yeah, I think social media is an interesting sort of double-edged sword for a lot of issues, and particularly with women's issues too, because the internet can be one of the nastiest places in the world, and it can be places where people are shamed and harassed and scared when they share things, but it can also be an incredible place for building community. Places where people feel they can speak things that they don't feel that they can say to people they know in person, where they can find real communities of people with shared experiences. And I think that there is something about, for me, about the specificity of narratives, right? Of an actual person or an actual experience. Not a theoretical experience, not a principle, not an idea, an actual experience. Sharing that with somebody else. And that's where I think people's ideas change. I think that's where people build communities of support that can turn into political movements. I think Twitter is always the best place for that. But I think there are spaces in social media that are really powerful for doing that. So I think social media has been a driver of polarization in some of the worst parts of our political discourse, but it's also been an incredible tool for really building networks that I think are politically very powerful and personally that are actually.
Okay, we have an online question.
That possibly all of you can comment on. It seems that myths and disinformation is prevalent and strongly affects voters' choices. Is it possible to reduce the impact of myths and disinformation in a country where freedom of speech is strongly protected? If so, what are some ways to reduce the impact?
Who wants to start on this one? Let's run the table here.
I'll take a crack at it. In K-12 schools, we do talk about media literacy. And so the question of how we're helping young people make good decisions around information, around reliability of sources, That's something that I would argue maybe was once an afterthought, and now I think for a variety of reasons is now at the forefront of many teachers thinking in terms of how they can bolster and support young people's ability to see information. Frankly, we don't use the word truth as much as maybe we did a few decades back, but I think once again, we're starting to ask those hard questions of what is the truth and how do you know it? And I think that's something that teachers are now embracing with extra verve and recognizing that in a world where there's quite a bit that can be distracting in terms of information, that we need to help young people. And I think that's something that starts presumably earlier than most of us might imagine.
Thanks for saying that, because I was gonna say we're doomed. I think the challenge is perhaps if we can have energy behind what we're talking about in terms of, you know, systematically preparing young people to be media literate and to understand, you know, not just what facts are, but how do you discern, you know, the probability of whether or not something's true or not. But I've been wrestling with that a lot. Like, I don't know how do we get out of this place? You know, I hate social media. I don't like television news, national or local. So I'm just, you know, I want to be a hermit.
Professor Damer, would you like to comment on this one?
Sure. You know, one of the things that I think most all of us who teach in this college like to think we emphasize is critical thinking. Right? We all want to think that we are teaching our students to critically think. I could think that the first step of critical thinking is actually reading. And I, you know, just hearing this, I was, you know, air my dirty laundry here. You know, when the 1619 project came out, my dad, I love you, Dad, but started, you know, had a conversation. He started asking me these very leading questions where I knew it was going. I knew that he had gotten some kind of message that there was this terrible thing out there. And my answer to him was, have you read it? Have you read this thing that you're suggesting to me is such danger? We have. I think that I emphasize with my students that it has to begin with reading. It has to begin with actually engaging what people are actually saying, as opposed to what people have said about what people say, which is so much of what social media is, right? That's a tweet is, I'm gonna say, I may link to the thing that I'm criticizing, but I'm gonna give you a little quick take. And it's very easy to just read the take and not read the thing that sparked that take. I think if we could just read a little bit, and my students are gonna love this, read more, that's my answer. But I think that is part of it.
Okay, we had another in-person question. Did you have a question back here? Or- An online question.
Since you brought up the 1619 project makes it controversial. Would it change the curriculum taught, or would it be injected or implemented?
So in terms of what makes it controversial, I think, you know, I see that there are some things about it that have been misrepresented, and there's some things that are genuine. So, you know, it genuinely does see slavery, racism as central to American history. And so that's shocking and upsetting to a lot of people. So that's genuinely, I think, a real reason why people have opposed it. In terms of how it's implemented, I couldn't really speak to that. I mean, I think it's implemented in different ways. I think that from my understanding is that, and here we're talking about high school teachers, I think some have used it as a way to teach controversy, right? As a way of teaching how there are different interpretations of the past. You know, often that has meant that they've coupled readings from that project with readings from critics of that. I think it's an absolutely appropriate way to approach this. But I think that's part of the problem, is that it's unclear what it means to introduce this into a curriculum, right? Is it, this is the way that we teach American history? I don't think that even the participants think that this is the only way to teach American history, the only way that you should teach. I think it's, the whole point is to think about this as one way of thinking about the past, and there are others.
I think the challenge with that is history is painful, right? And I wrote down when you were speaking earlier that history is dangerous. And when you teach things that are painful, you know, even if folks acknowledge that it's true, they don't want to think about it. But there are consequences to not thinking about it. There are democratic consequences to not thinking about it. And to the extent, it's not so much what you teach the 1619 project, but do you teach the ideas or the factual research that it's based upon? And too many students don't get exposed to it. You know, I every year when I'm teaching about the civil rights movement, you know, and I'll say some things that most people they haven't learned some of the basics of American history around race, and when they learn, they're shocked. Oh my gosh, how did that happen? You know, how could the government do that or say that? This is America. This is the America that we're talking about, right? And so it's kind of reflective of, you know, we don't have a common understanding of the history, especially as it relates to ways in which America maybe has fallen short of its supposed values, its supposed ideals, right? I think Martin Luther King said, you know, in his critique of America was, you know, we just want you to live up to what you said on paper, right? And that those ideas, that idea of critiquing America, but critiquing it on the basis of American ideals might be a way around this. That you can say, okay, we can be critical, but the measurement is the American standard. Let's just look at how we've fallen short of our standard, not necessarily critiquing the standard. And I think that might be a space that we can maybe all agree on moving forward in terms of whether it's teaching history or promoting American democratic ideals.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
For Dr. Barr, you were talking with regards to the states having more control over abortion, that it would change the dialogue between black and white, right or wrong, to a more like thorough discussion. And I know that with abortion, that often goes back to the implied right to privacy in the Constitution. Then, do you see this change in the way the dialogue is happening, changing how we talk about the Constitution? If that is the right to privacy leading to gay marriage or the Second Amendment, how does that change what it says versus what it doesn't?
That's a super interesting question. I mean, I think, you know, I'm a scholar of religion, right? And so a lot of the traditions that I study, they interpret their founding texts, they interpret their scriptures. The Constitution is the founding text of our country, and it's open to interpretation. There's whole schools of interpretation. You see different Supreme Court justices described in different schools. And I think that legal development and legal interpretation in many ways is driven by the facts on the ground, the ways things get played out in different cases. And I mean, if you think about how the Supreme Court works, right? For a case to get to the Supreme Court, it's got to go through like lower courts, the upper courts, the upper courts, the upper, you know, all the way through the appeals until that's the final arbiter. So I absolutely think the conversations that people are having on the ground are going to shape the ways that we think about the conversation, about the Constitution. And I think in part, it shapes the way both that we as citizens talk about the Constitution. What are the rights encoded in it? What does the right to privacy actually mean? I mean, I think in the case of you were pointing to, I don't know that everybody always assumes that the right to privacy is actually the relevant right when we're talking about something like abortion or marriage or things like that. In my casual discourse, that's not necessarily the right that most people point to. So I think that in itself sparks the conversation. But I also think the ways, I mean, very few of us, I assume, have actually sat down and read through like the Dobbs decision and all of these things. But if you want to nerd out about it for a second, which I encourage you to do, they're actually fascinating. The ways they think, the particularities of the case and the way it shapes which issues the court actually takes up. The ways they try to navigate through things. I think it really does show, there are cases coming up in the courts. I was just listening to something about who remembers of the baker who didn't want to bake the cake for the gay couple. There's a new case coming up in the Supreme Court in the new slate that's going to engage with a lot of those same issues, but in a different case. And if people, I don't know if you remember this, but in that issue with Baker, super narrow ruling based on the technicality of the procedure and something somebody said at a certain point. Now we get a new case with different details. The court's going to engage the issue from a different angle. And so I think that I think absolutely, I think we're gonna see different conversations happen as a result of what's going on, both at the sort of big core constitutional level and also at the lower levels. But I think it is worth noting, as you point out, I mean, the ways the conversation, there's a lot of different conversations that are happening. There's technical legal conversations, there's experientially based conversations, there's emotional conversations, there's religious conversations, there's politically charged conversations. I think all of those are shaping the picture of what the discourse is. I don't know if that gets it.
Right here?
So this question is for Dr. Ward. So you ask your students to, I guess, define what democracy is. So I'm just wondering what your definition of democracy is.
You did set yourself up for that one.
Well, actually, I'll building on your question. I think that if we think about democracy, it's kind of people, governing themselves. That's kind of the core of me. But I think that democracy is more than just voting. It's even for me, it's more than just making decisions. I think a lot of folks, their definition of democracy is that the people get to decide. But I think it's more than that. It's more than just deciding. There's an element of doing, right? And democracy requires not just making a decision, but also doing certain things and also taking on responsibility for, the society, the collective, whatever. So it entails all of that. And just to add on, I think that there's some folks who've been arguing that perhaps the way out of the polarization of the moment is to return to a focus on democracy or democratic interactions at the most basic levels, community level. Again, problem solving. And so I agree with the argument that if I'm a right wing Republican, you're a left wing progressive Democrat or green, right? We might see each other as just images and stereotypes. But if we're in the same room and we're trying to figure out how are we going to get this stop sign put up on the corner in our neighborhood, after a while we can collaborate, we can work together. We might agree that there should be a stop sign there. And then once we've done that, if we're successful, in the future, maybe you're a left-wing radical, but you're not a bad person. Or you may be wrong on those political issues, but you're not a monster. Right? You need the same way. So perhaps the way out of polarization is through greater democratic engagement. So that's what I've been thinking about a lot. I think that might be a step.
Thank you. Okay, we have an online question.
Is there something about this moment that's different from past challenges to democracy? I'm thinking about the 1880s and 90s or the Red Scare. Is it about social media?
Who wants this one? How about we start with our historian here?
That's a really great question. That's how you have to respond to all that. So you can get a little time to think. I get to say that. I think the question has kind of answered itself. I mean, I think what is distinctive about this moment and separates it from these other moments is the particular nature of our media and the way that dictates how we have to fight out these political conflicts. I mean, I think the question also reminds us that as fraught as our moment is, as frightening for some of us as this moment is, if we study history, we should remember that American history is full of these fraught and frightening moments, which it shouldn't necessarily be comforting to us, but it should also remind us that it is both a unique time and a time that that shows us continuity with American past. I've not answered the question, but I do think the question itself had the germ of the answer. I think social media is a huge and important part of that story.
Professor Kenwright, do you have a comment?
I do. I'm going to bring it down a little bit here for a moment to say I didn't want to mention this today, but there was an insurrection a year ago in January. I live in sort of the shadow of Washington, D.C., and I still can't tell you how heartbroken I was to see on live television folks crashing what is, by all accounts, the symbol of our democracy. And I think what was probably most unsettling for me when we talk about, are we worried about this minute or this moment in democracy right now, is we all saw what happened on January 6th. But what to me is remarkable is how many folks who were elected officials, some of whom worked in that building, stayed silent and didn't call out what was, I think, for most people, some wrongdoing. And since that time, the months that have unfolded, I am even more concerned about how certain narratives have unfolded where folks are now seen as patriots in terms of the work that they did on that day, rather than traitors. So I didn't want to mention the insurrection, but I have to, I think in part because our young people who are in junior high and middle school, they were paying attention. And that will have been a formative moment in their political development, like it or not.
Well, I'm actually surprised it took us that long to get to that, actually, to get to that particular incident. Okay, we have another online question?
What is the political landscape of Baltimore City? What party is most dominant, and what is the primary agenda of both parties with improving Baltimore City?
Okay, Dr. Works, I think this one is for you.
That's an easy one, the Democrats. There are very few Republicans. But, as I tell my students, that doesn't mean that there are political cleavages and debates and disputes and, strong political differences, even among people who share a political party, right? So Republicans are a very small minority of folks in the city, although there are some. It's typically in cities like Baltimore, people will be divided around, their vision of development, or their vision of what should the city's priorities be. How do we solve certain problems? How do we deal with the issue of crime, right? So you got a lot of folks who are Democrats who say, the way to deal with crime is, a stronger police presence. And you got other folks who say, no, we need to defund the police, and others who say, well, we need to do this or that or whatever. One of my former students is a city council member. He did a wonderful talk with my class last year talking about his district. And he said how, he's got Trump voters in his district that voted for him, that he's a Democrat. He's also got, other folks, he's got some folks in the district that are deep on the police and others who are, where are the police, right? And how do you navigate that in the city, in the district and then in the city? So to answer the question, there's a wide range of, there's a wide range of issues and interests that mobilize people in the city, even in a context where most people share a political party.
Thank you. Okay, other questions out there? Yes, sir.
How do we combat refusal to listen to and accept truth?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, how do we
combat the refusal to accept truth on the other side?
the question is, how do we combat the refusal to accept the truth on either side of the issue? Okay, thank you. Who wants to stab at this one? I guess actually, frankly, Mike, this one, you have to deal with questions of truth regarding climate change all the time.
What is truth?
That's a great question.
Teach and question. As a climatologist, right, I know the earth will be fine. That's a truth. That's a fact as much as smoking will kill you when the earth is flat. I'm sorry, round, whatever it is. Joke, really got that. But when I'm talking to people about climate change, sometimes I don't use the word climate change because it's a national security issue, or it's a public health issue, or it's my road is flooded in the city of Baltimore issue. And so that takes precedence. And I've heard this a couple of times tonight, is this issue of scale. Individual, community, neighborhood, state, federal, international, etc. And I think that issue of scale, as a geographer, is very difficult for many people to kind of get their grasp around. So we think about flooding as a hazard. We know seas are rising because of climate change. We know flooding is becoming more frequent, more common. Nobody really cares about causes, not that they don't, but they want to know how to stop the flooding in the neighborhood. And so that discourse is often, as a climatologist, that bothers me. Because I talk about right? But sometimes you have to step back from the truth to meet somebody to where they are. And then create a dialogue, what was said earlier, a dialogue that then is fruitful and that maybe advances forward in some positive direction.
Yes, please.
I think that whenever we are talking about truth, and convincing other people about truth, I always think of this talk I saw by Catherine Schultz, who wrote a book called Being Wrong. And she talks about how being wrong feels exactly like being right until you discover that you're wrong. You are as confident that you are right as you are when you're actually right until the moment it's revealed to you that you're wrong. And I think to me, that's an important piece of it, is understanding the experience of the person that you're talking to. I don't mean like their personal history, but just understanding they really have a reason that they think what they think. And you really have a reason that you think what you think. And you're both probably generally have good reasons, right? And so often, I think just starting from that openness to where they're coming from, even if you, I'm not saying to be open to their position necessarily, that you have to like change what you think. Just saying, look, you are a person who has reasons for thinking you're thinking. And I think that you're wrong, but like, how can we start to have a conversation about this as opposed to just being, sometimes it's, again, not even demonizing, but just like, we get in arguments with our friends and family, and we're like, why can't you just see this thing? It's so obvious. And I think we just forget what that experience can be like. And I also, for me, I think I'm wrong. And it feels just like being right until I realize that. And so coming out of that humility and understanding, I think can go a long way. I have really good relationships with people that I fundamentally disagree with about key political issues. And I think that doesn't need to be rare, but I think the only reason that is because I like them a lot as people. And I think that they're good, smart people who happen to be wrong. But I think that's actually really important to be able to say both of those things.
Real quickly, question for each of our panelists. Dr. Kenwright brought up this question of what's necessary or versus sufficient for democracy. Could each of you think of one word or phrase of something that is either necessary, you think is either necessary or sufficient for a vibrant democracy? And Dr. Kenwright, since you brought this up, I'm going to ask you to go first. So one word or phrase, like to bring us home today.
Intellectual freedom.
Intellectual freedom. All right, mic drop. There we go. All right, so we've got intellectual freedom, necessary or sufficient for democracy. Okay, Dr. Allen.
I would say engagement at every level.
Engagement at every level. Thank you. Okay, Dr. Works.
I would say humility and empathy.
Humility and empathy as necessary. Thank you, Dr. Works. Dr. Bear.
I like me at the end here. I was going to say empathy and participation.
So go with.
I know.
So we'll say participation or participation with empathy.
There we go. I like that.
Okay, participation with empathy.
So I've already said this, but so maybe a cop out, but I would say critical thinking.
Okay, critical thinking.
Professor,
Okay.
can I
You
amend
can go
my
back.
answer?
Sure.
Faith in the peaceful transition of power.
Faith in the peaceful transition of power.
One more.
Keep going. We can do more.
This is actually really important. The losers have to accept defeat, right? And so someone had a wonderful phrase where it said legitimacy is for losers. It's where you can accept defeat because you accept the process. You accept the legitimacy of the process.
So in essence, the legitimacy of the process is more important than the specific outcome.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else want to add another phrase? Anyone in the audience? Yeah, want to add something? Oh, yes, over here. Bella, we'll start with you. Ah, civic virtues. Thank you. Alex?
You said faith in power, but I would just say faith, period, right? Just believing that democracy works and that'll ultimately spread it, right?
Faith in democracy. Okay, others? Anyone else want to add something? You're all going to be thinking about it at 2 a.m. Something's going to come to mind. Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank all of our panelists today for coming and preparing and thinking with us. We have several faculty members here who are members of the committee that helped bring this event together today. The Democracy Today Committee and the Commemorative Moments Committee. If you're faculty on that committee, if you could raise your hands, be recognized and thanked. Online, too. Those that were online. A couple of them had to leave for family issues. Want to remind everybody that there is a voter registration table right outside. You're a student here at Towson, you can vote here. You do not have to go to wherever you lived in the summer or wherever your parents are or guardians are. You can vote right here in this community. Yes, Jordan. It should be, yeah. So, yep. Yep, right there. So nothing changes if you do not speak up. So this question of engagement is being absolutely key. Sorry? Speak up and vote. Yes, absolutely. And then let me also add that thank you all for coming. Deliberation is a key part of any successful democracy, any vibrant democracy. And we have modeled right here today a successful example of peaceful deliberation of very difficult and complex issues. And so I'd like to thank you all for participating in this conversation, and I hope that we can continue on sometime again soon. Thank you.